Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking about video compression, and really all that has to do with is different methods of or different settings for Handbrake, which is an encoding software that uses FFmpeg on the back end, and it's really just a front end for it. But anyway, uh, let's get to it. I have four examples today of four different encoding methods, not encoding methods, but encoding uh, settings, and an example of how each of them turn out. Now, to get a better idea of this, let's look at the source material first. Um, so, the source material is a Blu-ray rip of the 2014 movie Interstellar. So here we go. Let's look at the specific scene that I have cut out. And yeah. So as you can see, there's barely any, if any, artifacting that's visible. Um, a little bit on the water, but that's to be expected. Just because water is very bitrate heavy, it takes a lot of information to keep it um, not artifacting
This way.
in any real recording. And so as you can see, it's
About 200
very
meters.
good quality. And in a second here, this will be the scene that I'm here. So as you can see, this scene is very clear, it's very crisp. Towards the bottom half of the frame, you can tell the waves apart very easily. And if you look at their movement, it's very, very detailed. There's barely any, if any, artifacting. So, yeah. Now let's look at these examples. Now first, let's look at the specific settings that I have set up for each of these encode jobs. The first one, this is the interface Handbrake shows whenever you go to convert a video. That's the file name that I used at the beginning. I took a Fraps recording, which is a lossless screen recording of that scene of the movie as the source for each of these encodes, and they're each about 40 seconds long. So, video codec as listed is H.264 or X.264. The frame rate's the same as source, and I let it be a variable frame rate, even though it was always going to be 24 frames per second. I set this to be an average bitrate encoding, just to show the differences between encoding at the same bitrate but with different optimization settings or different encoder presets. So the first encode was done at 3000 kilobits per second. Did two passes, and it did a turbo first pass, so it got done with the first pass faster than it would have. The encoder preset is set to ultra fast, so this is a preset that you would use if you were looking to convert videos very quickly with no real worry about the expected quality of the video. There were no encoder tunes used. The profile is main and the encoder level is 4.0. So let's take a look at that example. So as you can see, there's a lot of blocking. That's called artifacting. And there's just a shit ton of it. And the blocks are very big. You know, the squares that you're seeing are very big. That's because the encoder didn't take a long time to figure out how to make those squares look the best that they could. It just knew that it needed to get done with a job as fast as possible. So it cut corners. In fact, it cut a lot of corners. And as we'll see in a few seconds here, and as you can see, there's a lot of pixelation. But right here, this is god awful. This is ugly. I mean, the top right, if you look at the top right of the screen, in this corner basically, these boxes are a little bit bigger than the boxes you see down here, specifically more in here. And that's because there's less detail up here to be filled in, and there's more detail down here. And what average bitrate encoding does, right here, this is specifying that each second will take up a maximum of 3,000 kilobytes, or excuse me, kilobits per second of data. What that does is that limits each frame to having a specific amount of data to work with to put all of the information about it, meaning the colors, the locations, and basically that's it. And also the pixel movements from frame to frame. All that information has to go into a very small sliver of the whole video, basically. And that's why there's not much information here to be used. That's why it looks so shit, because there's not a lot for the decoder to draw on. And yeah, it just looks like shit. So let's take a look at the next one. Oops, shit. That's not the next one. Alright, these two. There we go. So the next one, I went ahead and renamed it before I encoded. And the average bitrate is the exact same with 2-pass encoding and turbo first pass. Turbo first pass, excuse me. I set it to very slow so that it would take its time and do the very best encoding job that it could do. The encoder profile is the same main, level 4.0, and the tune is none. Everything else is the same except for this preset right here. I changed it from ultra fast. As you can see right here, it was set at ultra fast, and it was set to very slow this time. So let's take a look. Okay, so right off the bat, you can see that there's a very small amount of pixelation up here in these lighter areas, but in the darker areas there's still a fair amount of pixelation and artifacting going on. That's because specific blacks are, I mean, it's better just not to make specific blacks. You just split the gradient into, see, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3 specific gradient areas, and then it fills those pixels in with the closest match. So if this section right here looked pretty close to the blue-black that they used, or the blue-black that the encoder picked out as being the most used in this area, it was labeled as a blue pixel, and therefore that's what it shows up as. And then here, this region was a little bit darker, so it shows a different darker color, and then this region down here was even darker. And then up here, there's not much of a big discrepancy with all the colors, so it doesn't have as hard of a time. And it doesn't show up as badly either. But this is still the exact same file size. If we look at the file size on this file, the first file that we looked at, it is still 14.9 megabytes, and this file is also 15, well, it's almost exactly the same file size. So let's go back to it. As you can see, there's a lot less artifacting going on. The encoder really did a great job at compressing it into 15 megabytes for 40 seconds of 1080p HD video. And I picked this scene specifically because water is very hard on encoders, for the reason that a lot of movement is happening, and therefore a lot of information needs to be pumped into every scene to keep it from artifacting.
This way.
And so, yeah, I mean, the artifacts are a whole lot smaller. And as we'll see in a second here, this looks a whole lot better if we compare it to directly to this version. We go up to 35 seconds. Oh shit, 30. Look at that. Okay, there's a very real difference here, and you can definitely see that. There's the first, ultra fast, and there's the second, very slow. I mean, these two are just incredibly different for the exact same file size, and the only difference is the encoder preset. So it takes a really, I mean, it is very important whenever you decide to encode that you give your encode as much time as you possibly can. So here are two more examples of pretty much the same thing, except there's a little bit of a difference here. So yeah. As you can see, the average bitrate has changed from 3000 to 6000, so I gave it double the amount of data. So if we look at this file size right here, it should be close to 30. Yeah, it's about 30 megabytes. This second one is the same. Uh, it's within a reasonable discrepancy of how many bytes? Of 70,000 bytes. And 70,000 bytes is an incredibly small amount of data. So anyway, getting back to this, average bitrate is the same. This preset is very slow. We're going to actually look at this one second. Shoot, I'm sorry. So the differences here are 6,000, 6,000 are the same, but this one is set to ultra fast, and it is not given an encoder tune. This one does have an encoder tune. It is set to grain, meaning that the source had substantial grainy frames. It's film. It's based off of a film source, so it's got the grain look of a film, and this tries to preserve that. Encoder profile, that's high instead of being on main, so it's a high profile encode, and this is also set to 4.1 as opposed to 4.0. So here we have ultra fast at main, and here's very slow at high. So we'll take a look at the differences here. 6,000 kilobits per second is a pretty good amount of data to allot to a encode of a 1080p source. But still, as you can see, we do have artifacting. We have it very extremely down here. We have it on the helmet. This wall right here is very artifacted. And let's keep going. The water's still got a fair amount of artifacting, as you can see. The sky does as well. Those blocks are a lot bigger than these blocks. If you look at this small block right here, as opposed to these blocks right here, they're very different because this half of the frame has a lot more information and a lot more pixel shifts than this upper half, as you can see, just because of the waves. So it's not horrible, but it still has, I mean, I would not be able to watch this
This way.
as a copy of the film. I would
About
prefer
200 meters.
a higher priority or a higher profile encode. So yeah, here there's still some artifacting. You can see it up here as well. Down here is not as bad. But now let's take a look at the second example that was set to very slow and also given an encoder level of 4.1 and set to high profile. Well, here, let me open up another VLC window just so we can compare these two in a second here. So, first of all, as you can see down here, there's not as much artifacting, and the same goes for the wall right there and the helmet. The waves are a whole shit ton less artifacted, and if you look up here, there's barely any artifacting or any discernible artifacting. 6,000 kilobits per second is a good amount of data if you let your encoder have the time it needs to do its job right. So let's keep going. By the way, this is a great movie. I would highly recommend it if you haven't seen it already. Yeah, so this scene is just, I mean, there's a high amount of detail here. Barely any artifacting again. And when we look at the overhead of the waves, there'll be a pretty big difference, I think. And you can see the difference. I'll compare these two. So yeah, look at the top right, barely any artifacting. Down here, there's a very small amount. And let's bring up the other copy. Alright. Yeah. So here's this copy. As you can see down here, it's pretty artifacted, and up here. And then this copy, barely any. And down here as well, barely any artifacting either. Now let's compare the first and the last encodes that I've showed you. Overall, again, the only differences being, well, these are actually major differences. The differences being, this is set to ultra fast, and this is set to very slow. This is given an encoder tune of having grain, of the source having a grain on it. And this is also set to high profile at a level of 4.1. And this is set to main profile at 4.0. The second file also has twice as much information that it can put into every second than the first one. So don't be surprised by what you see. That is, it will be a very big difference here. Okay, so we can play them side by side and you will probably be able to tell that there's a difference here. I don't know why shuffle is on, but we're going to turn down the volume. Okay. So right here. Oh shit, I'm sorry. I opened up the wrong one, didn't I? Yeah, I did. Oh god. This is a lot. Yeah. There's a big difference here. As you can see, even on this frame right here. Just the extreme pixelation in this bottom right compared to right here, where there's barely none. Barely any, actually. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, there's a very big difference. And as long as you can tolerate your encoding taking a longer amount of time, um, you should do your best to just give it as much time as possible so it can do the best job it can. And I do recommend setting an average bitrate for each of your encodes that you want to, uh, if you have a given file size in mind. I specifically like my movies to be 6 gigabytes. Um, Usually 6 to 9 gigabytes is fine with me. Um, but yeah, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you learned maybe just something in this video about compression or encoding at all. And again, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good day, everybody. I'll see you next time.